Today, I'm very excited to have as my plus one, the only Liz Plank, who is a feminist writer, commentator. She has a bi-weekly newsletter called Airplane Mode, which I subscribe to and I absolutely love. Liz, thank you so much for being my plus one and joining me today.
Thank you for having me. I've been on the wait list for a while, so I'm happy to be here with you.
Now, we're having today as our guest Ezra Klein, who I know you're a big fan of. I'm a big fan of. As Semaphore said not too long ago, he was having a moment. He has an extremely popular podcast, and I always appreciate his point of view. Are you a big fan? Let's hope so, because he's listening.
Yeah, I'm a super fan. I had the privilege of working for Ezra when I was at Vox, and I still have an Ezra Klein voice inside my head that pops in sometimes of lessons that I've learned from working with Ezra. Like every time I did get time with him, I would leave with a really important thing that would stay in my head. And so I'm super, super excited to be talking to him today with you.
What are some of the just headline issues that you're looking to interrogate with Ezra?
Well, I think Ezra wrote an entire book about polarization. And obviously we think a lot about polarization in the sense of, political parties and political ideology. But recently, just with all of the data that's come out of the election and this huge and growing gender divide, I've been thinking a lot about it in terms of gender. And so I'm very curious to hear his thoughts about how we resolve this growing gap between women and men and us being kind of each radicalized in our own corner of the universe and the sort of political landscape right now.
Well, let's get to it. Ezra Klein, welcome to Next Question.
Thank you for having me.
I'm so happy to have you. And before we look ahead, I want to look behind us for a moment because you did get a lot of credit, Ezra, for being the leader of the pack, saying that Joe Biden must step down. Looking back on that whole experience, because I know you think highly of Joe Biden, you like him, you think he was a good president, any regrets for leading sort of the movement to replace him with someone else?
I think you give me in some ways more credit than I deserve. I don't think of myself as early or the media as early, certainly. The voters were there for a long time. A lot of what I was saying in those kind of pieces back in February was that you had in poll after poll 65, 75, 80%, which are hard numbers to get in American politics, of voters saying that he should step aside early in the Democratic primaries, or when there wasn't really a Democratic primary, but when there might have been a plurality or majority of Democrats, depending on the poll, didn't want him to run again. So I think I was like a lot of people who cover Biden and have a lot of affection for him and think he has been and is in many ways a good president, in sort of resisting what voters were seeing pretty clearly. And it was only when I could then see that in his efforts to allay those fears, like when he gave the press conference on the night of the special counsel report, that he really wasn't up to reliably campaigning in a way that would comfort voters in their essential doubt about him, that I sort of accepted what I think voters already knew.
In fact, you talked about comparing his campaign speeches from 2019 to one that was happening more recently. And you said the difference is glaringly clear, basically, in terms of his ability to be on the campaign trail. And I think a lot of people forget that he campaigned during COVID. So it wasn't that taxing the last go-round.
And he did campaign before COVID in the Democratic primary. But look, he was a slow-down campaigner in 2022. You go and watch, if you want to just see some amazing political performances, watch Joe Biden take Paul Ryan apart in the 2012 presidential debate. I mean, I know you covered this, Katie, and I mean, it was a masterful performance. People forget that Mitt Romney had just really humiliated Barack Obama in the first of those debates, and Democrats were freaking out. And it was Joe Biden, absolutely wrecking Paul Ryan, that restored some verve to the ticket that year. Go watch his convention speech in 2016. There was not a better speech at that convention. I mean, he just took Donald Trump apart. If that guy had run against Donald Trump in 2016, he would have won by 6 points. By the time Biden runs in 2020, he is slowed down, but he also is able to represent things that are important to the American people at that point: normalcy, experience, a kind of calm, a grace in politics. There are things Joe Biden gained along with age, right? Age takes from us, but it adds, right? And Biden, at other times in his career, could be very impetuous. He was kind of sharp-elbowed. He became a wiser politician. He became more coalitional. He became better at smoothing over ruffled feathers or relationships in the Democratic Party. And so he's able to run at a time when those things became important. And he was a right candidate for 2020 and in the end, not the right one for 2024.
But then, you point out, right, another speech more recently that you urged people to watch. Tell us about that one and what you saw.
Wait, which speech did I urge people to watch?
I think you talked
more
about,
recently?
you said to have people watch a speech that he gave, and then you compared it to a more recent one. I can't remember when it was exactly.
If this was back in the February piece, I think I used a clip from Biden's speech kicking off his campaign in 2020, and then his speech at Valley Forge kicking off his reelection campaign in 2024. And you can just hear it in the voice. Right. His voice, as many other people have noted, got sort of clotted and hoarse. And it would depend on the particular outing. Right. Biden had a range of sort of good days and bad days on the campaign trail. But there was he didn't have that energy. He wasn't able to perform in the way I think that you need to perform to campaign at this level. Then he had that State of the Union where he really seemed back to his old self. I mean, that was sort of like a really striking shift. But, it was not clear what was accounting for the variance in performance, between one and the other. And the problem is that a campaign is long, right? American presidential campaigns are marathons. And so the odds were you were going to get some significant bad performances at times that were going to be important. And that's what ended up happening at the first presidential debate. And so I would say I don't think I get credit for noticing what was in front of everybody. What I think gets credit is the Democratic Party, when that happened at the debate, it mobilized itself and it did something no party has done in the modern era, which is persuade a incumbent president to step aside for the good of the country and the good of the party. And I think Joe Biden gets credit for doing something that is extraordinarily rare, not just in American politics, but in politics worldwide, which is having ultimate political power, having a chance of keeping it, right? I mean, he was never that far behind Donald Trump in the polls. And giving it up because that was the better thing to do for the country. I mean, I know people who say, oh, he did it too late or he never should have run. Fine, say all that. But the kinds of personalities that become leaders of nations, these are people who want power, not people who find it easy to say no to power. And so what Biden did in the end, I do think was heroic and historic.
Yeah, he definitely solidified his legacy. And wasn't part of the reluctance for the Democratic Party to sort of acknowledge what was happening and what was unfolding in front of our eyes was, the fear that that there was no replacement, right? That Kamala Harris wasn't able to, didn't have the popularity that's required in order to become the candidate. And it was so interesting, to see. I think if there had been more time between Biden stepping down and then Kamala Harris becoming the candidate, maybe we would have had more time to talk about, is she electable? Can she do this? Can America get on board? And it's almost like because there wasn't enough time for people to doubt it, her popularity sort of spoke for itself. But I'm curious how you see that, when she ran for president, that this wasn't the most popular person. She had to step down. How do you explain her popularity right now?
So I think there are two things happening at that time. So one was a lot of people around Biden and the Democratic Party. This was not, in my view, some grand cover-up. And the way it wasn't a grand cover-up is because the Biden campaign team negotiated an early debate. They thought he could do it, right? And, maybe they were fooling themselves. Maybe they were seeing something we weren't. Maybe they weren't accepting things they were seeing some days. There are a lot of ways people sort of can negotiate internally something that is maybe not true or a reality they don't want to accept. But I do think that was happening. The view that they sort of knew this was a disaster is not aligned to what ultimately their actions really were. So I think you should believe their actions. But then, yeah, Liz, what you're saying is true. When I was doing this reporting, the thing that I kept hearing from people who understood Joe Biden's age to be a potentially insufferable political problem was, well, the only really likely replacement is Harris. and Harris cannot win Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin, right? And that was the view. And Harris had trailed Joe Biden in popularity for much of his presidential term. She was at that point still, to my knowledge, if I'm remembering the polling right, trailing him a bit. The Democratic Party had lost a lot of faith in her over the course of Joe Biden's presidency. I said then, I think it has proven true, that was always a little bit mysterious and she'd become underrated because nothing had actually gone wrong for her in any very significant way. I mean, she had a kind of bad Lester Holt interview, but that wasn't enough to explain how far her star had fallen among many sort of Democratic insiders. And
I
then
think, Ezra, just to interject real
Mm-hmm.
quickly, I think part of the problem was she was almost in the witness protection program. I think this philosophy of not making Joe Biden available for interviews and not having him interface with a lot of journalists kept her away from the press. They could have done even joint interviews that reinforced that they had a good working relationship. But I feel like he kept her away from the media. And I think that and then when she did interviews like the Lester Holt interview or some other interviews and didn't fare well, it solidified this idea that she wasn't that competent.
I think this one's hard to say. I know that she did an interview with you.
In January.
Kamala Harris she does not do many media interviews, right? That is an authentic, I think, thing to her. I don't think it's a strong format for her. I don't really understand why oftentimes. She's very, very good defending Biden after the debate. But in a lot of the media interviews she's given, she will not answer questions that are very straightforward, and she gets tripped up by straightforward questions in a way I don't understand.
It's almost like she's ticking off talking points.
Yeah, it's like you can watch her firing up the nearest script. Whereas in a debate, she's excellent, right?
I know, and when I
she was
saw
good in
her
interview with
debating,
you. I remember
thought,
listening to it while I was trying to think about all this and trying to find interviews of her. So I came across her with you, and I think that's one of her better interviews. So she's definitely capable of doing it.
Yeah, and I still think she often ticks off talking points. It's almost like she's afraid she's going to say something wrong. Mm-hmm. And as a result, and when I saw Kamala Harris debate, I thought, wow, she did a really good job. Perhaps she'll feel liberated to do more interviews because she's quick on her feet. She has she has a facility with facts and figures. And then it went right back to kind of sounding scripted in interview situations. I couldn't figure it out. But anyway, continue your earlier point, Ezra. I'm sorry to interrupt.
I'm not sure I remember what the earlier
you were
point
talking
was
about you were talking about Kamala Harris, and I can't remember either.
So there was this view that she wasn't up to it. This was a really big thing in the party, and to be fair, it was something that people around Joe Biden were saying in order to fortify his position. And then by the time he dropped out, there was not time for what a lot of people in the party thought they should have. By the way, something Kamala Harris quietly also thought they should have because she thought it'd be better for her, which was some kind of competitive process. And
in fact, you advocated that, Ezra. You said there should be an open primary process or an open convention so people could really determine who was the strongest candidate against Trump. Given that, were you surprised that her popularity, as Liz mentioned, was almost instantaneous and among Democrats, very, very strong?
I wasn't surprised that her popularity among Democrats was strong. I was surprised by how much her overall favorables among the electorate rose. Look, I think we're going to see in the election ultimately, right? If Kamala Harris wins the election, right, and she particularly wins it convincingly, the sense that Kamala Harris was terribly underrated is going to be true, right? It will just have been true. And if the polling error is in the other direction and Harris loses Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, then the sense that she is maybe not the candidate, a California liberal that you would have picked to run in those states, and she doesn't win North Carolina and Arizona, which look like harder states for her anyway, then the sense that the Democratic Party probably didn't have, the exact person you would have wanted to run in those states is going to congeal. I am not willing at this juncture. I think she's been a much stronger candidate, and I did podcasts about how she's underrated and had always said that no matter what process you do, she is the most likely candidate out of it. So if you wanted to replace Biden on the ticket, as I did, you always had to be comfortable with Kamala Harris being the candidate because she was probably going to win no matter how you did it. And I was comfortable with that, so I was willing to make that argument at a time some people didn't think it made sense. But look, if Democrats lose this year, there's going to be a lot of anger. If they lose because of Pennsylvania, where she didn't pick Shapiro, there's going to be a lot of anger. So you've been around this longer than I have, but I'm always careful before getting ahead of a narrative when we haven't seen the election play out.
Let's talk about Trump calling her mentally impaired. There don't seem to be any consequences for him making statements like that. And gosh, a whole myriad of other insults. He does, though, seem to be having a hard time running against her and be slightly flummoxed by her candidacy. A friend of mine said the lummox is flummoxed. And so I'm curious your observations on how he's trying to position her and position himself against her.
My observations about Donald Trump's positioning. I think with Donald Trump, you are dealing with someone who is intuitive and not strategic, and that's who he's always been. The people who say there's maybe been some age-related deterioration in him, I mean, he's not a spring chicken, as they say. I think that's probably true as well. His inability to stick to a line of attack on her as a leftist California flip-flopper will... I was speaking a minute ago about how narratives take hold after elections. If he loses this election convincingly, which in my view is a pretty good shot, the view that he completely blew for him a winnable election because he didn't have a shred of self-discipline will take very strong hold. He could have run against her on inflation, on the set of positions she took in 2020, where she swung very far to the left to try to outflank Bernie Sanders. The Joe Biden administration is unpopular, and his record is unpopular, and she is part of that administration. I mean, the way that a normal Republican candidate, right, if the Republicans had gone another direction and picked Nikki Haley, the way Nikki Haley would run against Kamala Harris is obvious. It writes itself, and I think most people would bet that Haley would have won. And Donald Trump, he can only be who he is, and her ability to dangle obvious bait at him during the debate and say, on his strongest issue, immigration, but you have, bored people wandering out at your crowds.
I was going to say his second strongest issue, crowd size.
Yeah, right. And the guy snorts and paws at the ground and charges. It wasn't just that he's got that failure in the moment at a debate. It is a core personality problem in him, right? A core temperamental problem that is playing out all across the election.
Yeah, and you brought up discipline, which I think is such an important word. I was watching Joe Rogan's take on the debate, and who has obviously a very big audience, and Trump is really trying to tap into this corner of the internet, this very large corner of the internet where a lot of young men, spend a lot of time, and he, really focused on. To him, the discrediting thing about the debate was his lack of discipline, that she came off as more, not just more prepared. And it's funny, during the clip, he actually credits her team. He doesn't even credit her, but interestingly, but still, gives her and the team the credit of being able to stay on topic. And to me, discipline is actually a masculine or traditionally masculine quality, right? There's definitely, and I think we're going to get into just the gender divide of this election. A lot of men, are not on board with Kamala Harris and are, have been moving away from the Democratic Party for a while now, but it's even more significant in this election. And part of me wonders, watching Kamala Harris, her speech at the DNC and some of these, media appearances, they almost seem like, yes, she's talking about abortion. She's talking about reproductive rights. She's definitely speaking to women. But some of these, I think, sound bites are for the dudes, her talking about America being the most lethal force in the world, talking about shooting people if they come into her home. Do you see her kind of signaling to men and male voters in a way that's maybe not as overt as what Donald Trump is doing? And do you see it working?
I don't. I probably have a slightly different view on where it comes from, though. I think there's a bunch of interesting things to pick up on there. I'd love to talk. I feel like you could do a whole podcast on this question of whether discipline is male-coded in American politics, and I'd love to think about that. Kamala Harris comes out of a a black political tradition. She is a moderate, law and order, black urban politician, right? That's where she comes from in San Francisco. And San Francisco is thought of as very liberal. In many ways, it is very liberal. But as somebody who's lived there and grew up in California, San Francisco is a city that has always struggled terribly with disorder, right? With drug use, with homelessness, with a kind of burbling chaos that often feels like it is only inches from consuming much of the rest of the city. And Harris emerges as a DA there. She runs against the existing DA as bad at winning prosecutions. She, becomes AG of California on a somewhat similar argument, running against a more law and order Republican from Los Angeles. And right and left, male and female, the kinds of voters Harris cut her political teeth knowing how to appeal to were voters who wanted somebody who would catch bad guys, who would put bad people behind bars. I mean, the movement, which I think is the cause of a lot of her sort of political instability in 2020, where the Democratic Party wanted her to succeed, but had turned sharply against law and order politics. And that creates this kind of space where she can't be who she really is politically, but never really finds another political identity to inhabit, and then ends up kind of looking coreless and having taken a bunch of positions she's now walked back from. What Harris is re-inhabiting here when she puts out these ads where she's, stalking across the border and, saluting border guards and saying, fixing the border is tough. And so is Kamala Harris, and saying if anybody comes into her house, they're going to get shot. Right. If you look at black politicians from urban areas, over the 90s, over the 2000s, this is a long political tradition. I mean, go back to the 80s, go back to the 70s, right? There's nothing actually all that new about it. And it's really that Democrats kind of abandoned it for a period of time. And now she's running at a time when, she can pick it back up. And even more than that, running against a guy who's a convicted criminal, which allows her to really re-inhabit that.
So if that's the case, why are so many young men, this is what I'm fascinated by, and I know Liz is too, are turned off by Kamala Harris? There's an NBC News poll of Gen Z adults found that young women favored Harris over Trump by 30 points, while young men favored Harris by just 4 points. Let's dig into the gender gap for a few minutes, Ezra. What is happening with young men in this country? Why do they seem to be gravitating, or some of them, to the kind of macho Donald Trump messaging that we're hearing again and again, and that he's going to protect women, which we'll talk about in a moment. But what is going on with young men?
So this is candidate agnostic, I should say. There was a big Wall Street Journal piece on this using Biden and Trump polling a couple months ago. And so Biden was hemorrhaging support among young men. That's part of why Donald Trump's night at the RNC was like a Vegas show about masculinity, right? You had Hulk Hogan ripping off his shirt to, for all the little Trumpsters out there. And you had Dana White, the head of the UFC, introducing Donald Trump. I mean, the whole thing was the campiest masculinity.
Macho man.
It had
you just expected the
as a
village
text
people.
As a text for Judith Butler, it was extremely rich. So you get that happening. I mean, what's happening with young men? Right, I wouldn't tell you I know entirely, and I'd actually really love to hear Liz as part of it. But we have had a very sharp, in this era of politics, and particularly digital politics, shift in sort of the mores, right? We talk about the future is female, and we talk about toxic masculinity, and there's a million descriptions of how traits that are traditionally male are bad. You have the whole Me Too movement.
You have DEI, which left a lot of white males feeling marginalized.
There's that too. And you then have the rise of people like Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate. There's a lot of, can you say any of these politically correct things? And all this is sort of much of it is very good. Much of it is natural, right? You're having a feminization of politics and power generally as people sort of push to have more representation. But that's going to create backlash, right? I mean, that is the nature of every political movement like this that we have ever seen. And you're seeing it, I think, specifically among young men. I do think it is somewhat supercharged by the way media fractures, and you have a lot of young men in sort of, Twitch politics, right? In sort of sports sports talk radio, which has become somewhat more right-coded in recent years, although that's not all that new. People forget that Rush Limbaugh begins as a sports broadcaster, not as a political broadcaster. Joe Rogan is, I think, not as right as he is sometimes made out to be. But he is a kind of frustrated, masculine id politics. And I would say, in general, the Democratic Party was not trying to talk to men. And when it was in a pretty scolding, dismissive tone. The sort of elevation of Tim Walz as a kind of masculinity that can be embraced and rallied behind is a pretty significant change from where things were 4 years ago, maybe even a bit more than that. So I think we've been through a pretty intense oscillation in politics, not the only one, but one of them that has been really alienating to young men who were coming of age as part of it. And they began gravitating to voices who said, no, you don't have to change everything about you. In fact, you're great. You should be watching combat sports and saying things that offend people and risk taking and all the things that sort of appeal to you and playing your video games and whatever. And then sort of Donald Trump comes up and tries to embrace that, I think, in crypto and all the rest of it in maybe a ham-handed way, but nevertheless a very obvious way. And I think it's actually to the credit of Harris and Walz and the Democrats that they're trying to come up with a sort of counter narrative here. But yeah, I think you're looking at backlash to what was a very rapid and intense ideological shift and change. But Liz has been sort of part of this and been part of the internet in this period. So I'd be curious for her take on that.
Me too. And I wonder also how effective a masculine archetype Tim Walz actually is. Is he enough to sort of mediate some of these feelings of anger among young white men? Liz, your thoughts?
Oh my gosh. Also, it could just be a whole hour on this. Yeah. To me, Trump was always running as a man, right? And that sounds like obvious, right? But we really don't think about, when we think about gender, we think about women. And we've been, talking, there's so many ways that women's lives are gendered, but like men's lives are so gendered too. And back in 2016, Trump was, again, playing up his masculinity in all kinds of different ways. And by the way, Trump is not the first, candidate to do this. I think amongst Republicans, it's very charged. I mean, Marco Rubio wore heels, when he ran for president. I mean, allegedly, right? Like, we don't have any proof, but to appear taller, right? Trump called Ted Cruz the P word, right? Calling him basically a woman and discrediting, sort of demeaning him using that kind of language of emasculating him. And I think this time around, he is doubling down on it. And I totally agree with Ezra. I think that there's been such a void basically on the left. And, I was listening to
You mean a void in terms of appealing to young white men?
Yeah, or just talking about men, right? You have one party that speaks directly to men and in very, it's not a subtext, it's very overt, right? In 2016, it was, it's harder for men now than it is for women. Trump saying that around the Kavanaugh hearings and sort of post Me Too. So you have one party that's acknowledging the feelings of a lot of men. And you have the other party that is, I think, often completely ignoring those feelings. And it's almost like the new deplorable, where I think sometimes in Democratic circles, you will hear someone bring up masculinity or bring up disaffected young men. And it's sort of like, well, those guys are red pilled. Those guys are almost, right? Like, we don't even want to try and convert those people. And to me, it's such a missed opportunity. And Ezra, I was listening to your interview with Richard Reeves, which everyone should go listen to. It's a really interesting conversation. And I think one of the few conversations where that holds space both for talking about men's, just what's sort of happening to men and boys in this country and sort of around the world, and holding space for what's happening to women, and actually connecting those conversations, to me, has been the biggest failure. I think in the progressive movement, that a lot of the problems that do plague men have to do actually with patriarchy, have to do with a lack of nurturing of boys and men, and that men should have, men should be in charge actually of redefining, what it could be to be a man. And that doesn't mean, this sort of feminizing of men, or this taking away of things that men can be, that it's sort of like a Swiss Army knife, right? It's about offering more ways for men, more tools for men to have, and more ways of expressing themselves, not limiting. But I don't think we've always, and sorry, I'll end on this note, but I think that Democrats actually have a lot of policies that are very helpful to men, and they don't, and I think Richard Reeves talks about this, they don't message it. And then, on the right, I think you have policies that actually might be detrimental to them, but they're very good at messaging, that this will help you. And so I see this, that as one of the main disconnects. But I'm curious about both of your thoughts on my whole rant.
Well, there's a lot to chew on there, Liz. I think you're right, though. I feel that they have been ignored and disregarded, and it was just a lot, all those things that Ezra outlined, coming fast and furiously from Me Too to now more law students and med students are women, to, as I mentioned, DEI, and feeling like that they weren't going to get into the school of their choice because of affirmative action. I just think it's a whole crock pot of things that they have seized on. But I do want to pick up what Ezra said about Tim Walz, as a way to kind of balance where the Democrats were going. How do you think he helps Kamala? Because as you said earlier, a lot of people may second guess the decision not to tap Josh Shapiro. But how does this archetype, in your view, or is it enough to bring in some of these young disaffected male voters?
I'll say it's a dangerous time to be trying to answer this question, because the vice presidential debate, which will be his best chance to help Kamala Harris, is tomorrow night. So anything I say might end up looking very different one way or the other after that debate. But
let's not even talk about the debate. Just talk about sort of his candidacy writ large.
But the reason I mentioned the debate, because I do want to timestamp where we are, is he probably won't help Kamala Harris here. Vice presidential candidates genuinely don't, right? So they generally do not do a lot in one direction or another. I don't think
I
Joe
would
Biden,
argue that Sarah Palin hurt John McCain.
You can in extreme conditions hurt. Right. And I think J.D. Vance is hurting Donald Trump for other reasons. But I would be surprised to see Walz help. I will say I've been a little surprised and frankly dismayed at the way the campaign is using, or I will say not using, Tim Walz. I had him on my show like 4 days before he was named vice president. It's one of my favorite interviews I've done with a politician ever. And we talk about the problems of young men, and he's great at talking about it. And Tim Walz won that vice presidential slot in large part because of how good he was in the media, how good he's a rare politician who, when you interview him, you can see him thinking and responding in real time. And they locked him up the same way they've locked her up.
Why?
I don't understand the level of caution that campaign has, but I would be putting Tim Walz on like Lex Friedman, on Joe Rogan.
On Next Question.
On Next Question, of course.
Even though he's probably speaking, preaching to the choir. But you're right. Why aren't they?
I would have him out. I would have him out on sports talk radio, right? That's a dude who can talk sports. He ran, he helped coach a team to the state championships. Like, let Tim Walz be Tim Walz. Like, let Kamala Harris go out and be Kamala Harris. They're running in very risk-averse ways, which I kind of get, but they're not that far ahead, right? They're not so far ahead that I wouldn't like to see them trying to pick up marginal voters in places where the people who are sort of on the bubble about them might reside.
Well, you're an insider. Why are they running the campaign this way, Ezra? I feel like you've got a lot of sources within the campaign. Do you ask them about that? Because I'm very frustrated, too, because not only because I want to interview both of these people, but I just don't understand why they are not everywhere. And now I feel like when they do interviews, they do so few. The stakes are really high. And, Stephanie Ruhle, I think, is a great journalist, but she did an interview with Kamala Harris after she basically said on Bill Maher she doesn't need to do interviews.
Yeah, that was
basically
that was a weird look for them to choose that right after that. I mean, for all I know, that was decided before. But look, I don't know why they're not. I know that the view of this is many of the same Biden people, right? Her campaign is run by many of the same people. And their view was that interviews don't help them that much, particularly in the media. And you know what? I think that's a totally reasonable perspective instrumentally to take, right? I wish they wouldn't take it because I do think it is good for people to see the candidates, and there's an informative role to sitting and doing. I would love to see Kamala Harris, like, she's always welcome on my show to talk about serious economic policy and housing. And I've said that to them and await the response. But I think a lot of people hear this as special pleading from the media, which is fine. Politically, because I think they're probably right that they're not picking up, like when they go on MSNBC, right? They're not converting a single voter, right? They are doing that to say they did another interview. They're converting no one. The interviews politically, if I were running a campaign, I would want to see is in places where they're trying to get people who do not look at them positively, right? Again, as I was saying, I would love to see Tim Walz going on the kinds of podcasts and YouTube shows where these young, disaffected men are, sports talk radio. I mean, Katie, you mentioned a couple times, not trying to appeal to young white men. They're losing men of color. Right? They've been hemorrhaging support among men of color in recent years. So try to go out to the places where the marginal voters you might need are. I think they feel that they are running a bit ahead of Donald Trump, and there's probably more downside risk than upside risk. And also, and you know this, you've covered, a lot of presidential campaigns. Campaigns almost always have the character of the campaigner, right? Like as any organization does, even if it doesn't really want to, organizations take on the preferences, the temperament, the tendencies, the strategies of the people who are at their center. Kamala Harris doesn't like doing interviews. The Kamala Harris campaign does not prioritize doing interviews. She does like doing speeches. They prioritize doing speeches, right? Donald Trump is doing way fewer rallies, but it is a campaign that likes rallies to the extent that it likes anything. And he likes going on in these sort of weird, talky formats. So he does that. Campaigns ultimately, whatever even their strategic views are, they end up reflecting what the candidates actually want to do. When you're sitting there with a million things to do with the time of these two people, and, you say, hey, Vice President, we have a couple of ideas for podcasts you should go on. And she's like, oh, really? Do we have and you got to really justify it. And what if it goes bad? Soon enough, you stop suggesting that. And you're like, hey, we've got 4 more places in Pennsylvania you can make a stop at. And she's like, great, we're doing that.
Before we dig into J.D. Vance, and I know Liz has a lot to say about him, and as do you, Ezra, and the future of MAGA and how he kind of represents a new breed of MAGA. You did a podcast on this, Ezra. I want to ask you about the criticism that she hasn't gotten specific enough in policy issues. I interviewed Hillary Clinton recently, and she made the point that Hillary, was criticized for being too specific and kind of suggested there might be a double standard. She said Trump himself claimed only to have a concept of a plan when asked about health care reform in the debate. And Hillary said to me this: I was accused of being too specific, a lot of other things, but certainly that. She said, I put out a book about my policies. I gave speeches about my policies. At the end of the campaign, nobody knew anything about my policy. And I think it's just a trap. First of all, for such a short campaign, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so she's basically saying it is veiled sexism, these demands for Kamala Harris to get more specific about policy when Donald Trump is kind of all over the place. I'd love to get your take on that idea. What do you think of this idea that there may be something else going on and it may be thinly veiled sexism, Ezra?
I think that's ridiculous, honestly, that it's thinly veiled sexism to want policy details from candidates. As somebody who's covered policy among many male candidates, we want it from them. As somebody who's attacked Donald Trump relentlessly for not having details on his policies, and that's why actually Project 2025 has entered the picture, because it offered the detail Trump didn't, right? I think being vague has actually hurt Donald Trump. I have a different view, I think, on Kamala Harris and policy releases, though, than a lot of people. Look, they just released an 80-page economic policy briefing book. And to be honest, I don't think it's that helpful at all. I don't really care about candidates having 150 different policies, right? It was something Clinton is talking about. I do think it was part of her brand that she knew everything about policy, and that was helpful to her, in my view, not hurtful to her, but nevertheless, it wasn't obviously helpful enough. But for Harris, what I wish they had for her, what I wish she had, was the 2 or 3 policies that it feels like she feels really strongly about. So she's having a lot of trouble, repeatedly trouble, answering the question, what will you do first? Right? Which is a very obvious question. Presidencies are all about prioritization. She sits down. This happened with Dana Bash. This also happened on a Pennsylvania with a local kind of television anchor or something, a reporter in Pennsylvania. And she gets this question, like, what are you going to do specifically? And she's like, well, I'm a middle-class kid and I come from here. And the thing she doesn't really have is the couple of policies that it feels burn within her. To the extent she does, the one where I think this is a huge exception is Roe. I think you can tell when she talks about Roe that she will do absolutely everything in her power, that if you elect Kamala Harris, she's going to do everything Kamala Harris can do to make sure abortion rights are restored and protected. Right? Maybe she will not be able to do it because of the Senate filibuster, but she's also said they should make an exception to the filibuster for that. So that's something where when she talks about it, you can feel that you are hearing this is what this presidency will be about. On economic policy, they have a bunch of policies. I can tell you about them. They have an earned income tax credit expansion now. They have a $6,000 credit for the first year of a baby's life. They have an expanded child tax credit.
$25,000 for first-time homeowners.
Yeah, there's a lot of different things going on.
But even like asking her, how are you going to pay for that? That sounds insane to me.
Well, to be fair, that policy is so weirdly targeted. It is first-time homeowners whose parents did not own a home. And then there's an income. Like, when you read the details, I think they've so micro-targeted, it probably will not be that expensive, weirdly.
Oh, got it.
But it's also not that good of a policy for that reason. But I had an old political mentor. I've said this a lot of times this year because it's always in my head, Mark Schmidt, who used to say, it's not what you say about the policies, it's what the policies say about you. You could say a lot of things about Donald Trump and his total lack of policy detail, but Donald Trump usually has 2 to 3 things he talks about, and the point is not the policy. The point is that he is signaling what he really fundamentally strongly believes. And his, I'm going to deport every undocumented immigrant in the country is saying, I hate immigrants, and I'm going to do everything in my power to make America an unwelcoming place for immigrants of all kinds. His universal tariff proposal reflects his belief that America is in a constant zero-sum competition with other countries. We are losing that competition. And the way to prosper as an economy is not to cooperate with other countries, but to use our power to negotiate more and more aggressive deals with them. Donald Trump does not release big, detailed policy documents, but he talks about a couple things that actually do give you a sense of what he really cares about. What I would like to see on economic policy, I cannot tell you, as somebody who's covered Harris for years and knows her economic advisors and has read her whole policy book and has read her policy speech and is actually trying to do the work here, that when she comes into office and she's to decide what to do, right? Like with her scarce political capital when she wins the election, if she wins the election and if she wins the Senate and the House, and they have, like a tight majority, what are they going to really prioritize? That's the question. Not what do you think about every policy, but what are the 2 to 3 things that really define not just you, but the way you see the problems America has right now? Hillary Clinton had 1 billion policies, and not that many of them said that much about her. But the thing that her policies said about her is that Hillary Clinton knew what she was talking about on everything. And that was known about Hillary Clinton. And it's one thing a lot of people admired about her and still admire about her. I don't think Harris needs to try to be Hillary Clinton in that way. But having a couple of ideas that reflect who you are and your core concerns in politics, I don't think it's a thing to throw overboard.
What do you think she should say? So in addition to having this burning desire to be an advocate for abortion rights, in your view, and knowing her and covering her, what do you think they are? Or is that a problem that we don't know and you don't know?
I don't think I know on a bunch of issues. And I've done the reporting to try to understand this. I've been very excited to see the degree to which he's emphasized housing affordability. But I've read those policies and I don't think they're that strong. They're very, very tightly targeted. It's like an expansion of a credit if you're building homes that are affordable for only first-time home buyers. Like, there's one really good policy in there. It's a $40 billion grant program for states and localities that they can apply for it if they have sort of packages of sort of regulatory changes, et cetera, that you're pretty sure are going to build more
so
homes.
We get it.
Yeah, so like that's good. I would like to see that. But I don't think that policy package, when you really read it, if you ask me, is that going to fulfill her promise to build 3 million homes? I will tell you absolutely not. And I've talked to a bunch of housing experts, and they will tell you, if they're being honest, almost certainly not. I don't know on the economy what drives her. She was one of the leaders in the Senate on expanding the child tax credit. So I could imagine that being it. And she does have a good proposal for expanding the child tax credit. She doesn't talk about it in the way or with a frame where I'm sure like that's the thing she's really gonna try to sell. It could be something else, right? For Bernie Sanders, it was obviously Medicare for all. For Elizabeth Warren, it was reducing corporate power. There are a bunch of policies that you could tell really drove her on that. I think this is the hardest thing for Kamala Harris, whose background is in law enforcement. I think Harris is amazing when she's talking about rights. I think that she has a lot of views on safety. I think it would have actually made sense for her to emphasize safety a lot more than she has in the campaign. But when you ask me what would I like it to be, the problem is this is a hard thing to fake, right? I've got mine. I'm an obsessive about housing supply, but it's got to be hers, right? And I think one of the problems she's having talking about economic policy is the opportunity economy thing. It sounds pulled, right?
Yeah, what does that mean even?
And every politician has always said they're going to build an opportunity economy. So I'm not trying to be too hard on this. A lot of these policies are good. I love an expanded child tax credit. I believe in expanding the earned income tax credit for childless adults. Like there's a lot in there that I support. But what they're doing now is they're building out a policy book and not a policy argument. And I would like to see them build out a policy argument.
You mentioned childless adults. Liz, let's talk and end by talking about J.D. Vance.
Wow, that was quite a segue.
No, I don't mean Liz is a childless adult, although she is.
I am. Yeah,
but she's written extensively about this. And of course, this has become a huge hot button issue, as we all know, with J.D. Vance and the childless cat lady and all that kind of conversation. So, Liz, let's talk about J.D. Vance. What would you like to ask Ezra, or what would you like to say about him?
Yeah, I really have loved your commentary about it, Ezra. Sort of his obsession with fertility, right, and having children, but having children in sort of the right way, right? Because he's against, or he's not supporting, the protection of IVF, but he. Anyway, it's inconsistent, right? But they clearly want a sort of traditional family model. But I guess I'm curious. Sorry. What I really loved about your take on it is that you compared it to the way that the left feels about climate change. That it feels like this existential sort of threat. I'm curious, like, where that comes from, and is that the sort of thing that resonates with sort of young men and young voters, or is that, or like, what's their strategy?
This fear
there?
that there aren't going to be enough kids, basically.
Yes, this sort of, the whole replacement theory, and the idea that yes, we need more children, we need white children essentially, and that come from this nuclear household heterosexual, structure. Why is there this obsession with fertility, and do you think it's working? Do you think it's reaching voters?
Oh, I definitely don't think it's reaching voters. I don't think these have been politically well sold arguments. Yeah, so on the right, there has emerged a sort of overarching macro fear, which is that America specifically, but the globe generally, is entering into a kind of extended multi-generational demographic collapse, and that the thin edge of the wedge, or the tip of the spear, is a place like South Korea. The total fertility replacement rate for a society, right, the number of kids that families should be having in order to maintain that society's population, is called 2.1, 2.2. South Korea is at 0.9, right? So South Korea is entering into geometric shrinkage, right? That actually is civilizationally threatening to South Korea. It is not clear what happens after you turn over a couple generations like that, when you have a society built for however many people are there now. It's a big country. And, then you have a small fraction of that. America, and I'm so worried about getting the numbers wrong. I want to say it's 1.7. It might be 1.3. I think it's 1.7. But you should check it, because I've done a bunch of episodes on this, and now so many different countries are in my head.
Yeah.
But the thing is, it's happening everywhere. Right. So Italy, highly Catholic country, I believe their demographic replacement is something like 1.3. If you look at the Nordic countries, right, which when we talk about what are pro-fertility policies on the left, we often talk about what they do. Very, very excellent paid family leave, including for men, excellent child care. They're at like 1.1. There are very few societies, really almost none around the globe, that are not seeing a very sharp decline in fertility. And this reflects women having much better opportunities in the world, right? So, the sort of opportunity cost of having children goes up. It reflects birth control, right, being effective so people can plan out their fertility. And so the right has become kind of obsessed with this, right? And it's not a totally crazy thing to worry about. That if you just kind of imagine this rolling forward, what's going to happen when humanity just begins shrinking, sort of year on year and year on year without sort of an obvious way to stabilize it. And the fact that no country, not Japan, not South Korea, none of these countries where there's been a lot of worry about this has been able to turn these numbers around also makes them nervous. So what some of these people like J.D. Vance have come up with is, if you sort of look in these more post-liberal Catholic right circles that he's part of, is, at least among other things, like scolding people, right? Yelling at you and trying to make it socially and culturally unacceptable, shameful, embarrassing to not be having children. Like, that's what this thing about miserable childless cat ladies are, right? The idea is that elites in power need to stop talking about how everybody should live like whatever life they find fulfilling, and begin saying that if you are not, coupled up and having children, you're a sort of pathetic, selfish.
Yeah, let's focus on the individual, right?
Yeah.
And what the individual wants, we're seeing.
So this, I would say it reflects like a real thing that I think it is worth thinking about. I do think that you should ask hard questions about societies that have devalued having children in the way that I think a lot have, or cultures that have devalued having children, that don't support them. I mean, what does it mean if you don't have a belief that it is worth sort of, extending the chain of humanity out into the future? And on the other hand, to talk about it the way they're talking about it, to think about it the way they're thinking about it, is it's often cruel. It's ineffective. I don't think it is thoughtful, right? They're not working with like the actual questions they should be working with, right? Which is, okay, if a lot of people are looking at what it means to have a family in the modern era and saying, I don't want that, or I wanted it but can't have it, right? Many families have fewer children than they would like to have. Then what, right? There are a lot of things you could begin to imagine doing. Some of them technological, and some of them, financial, right? And some of them societal.
A lot of my daughter's friends say they don't want to have, or a number of them have said they don't want to bring a child into the world because they're afraid the world they're bringing the child into.
I hear that. I'm always really skeptical of that one, to be honest. When you think about what the world was like any time in human history before 1950, functionally, and I mean 1950 in rich countries, right? For most of human history, half of all children died, right, before their 15th birthday, and we brought children into the world. There's something to me, of all the arguments here, the liberal argument that climate change or something else has made the world like too terrible to bring kids into. And then I think about, my ancestors, like having my great-grandparents as they were fleeing from pogroms. Something about that always like that's like too much comfort of modernity has infected our thinking.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's a financial, right? Like I think sort of what you're getting to is a lot of policy would actually encourage people to have children and make it, easier. And those aren't the things that J.D. Vance is, necessarily supporting. Like he's not, saying, let's get, men parental leave and let's make sure that there's universal childcare, or that people can afford their groceries and their rent and housing, right? Like all of those things are also connected. I think a lot of young people aren't having kids because they can't, not because they don't want to.
This gets to a real schism in the MAGA movement, I think, which is interesting and worth thinking about, which is that there's sort of two big streams in what people kind of call MAGA or the new right. And like one side of it is this weird post-liberal, heavily Catholic influenced conservatism that J.D. Vance is part of, right? And it's very concerned about things like fertility collapse. It is very concerned about things like abortion. It thinks, we don't have enough virtue anymore and men can't be men and blah, 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 blah. And then there's this other one, which, sometimes is called barstool sports conservatism after the
Right.
Dave Portnoy site, which is this more libertarian, like dudes playing video games and drinking beer and just like want to be left alone. And they don't like the censorious woke liberals. And sort of during the pandemic and during the sort of post-George Floyd moment and the Me Too moment, these groups kind of came together. But they're actually not only are they not the same, they're not anything like each other. right? They're deeply opposed to each other, right? I mean, Dave Portnoy and that crew do not want abortion banned because it might mean they have to take care of children they don't want to take care of. And, the sort of skepticism of birth control, right, that you see on the sort of the other side of the right, the sort of, more reactionary right.
They want to ban porn. I mean, the reaction.
They want to ban porn on the first page of Project 2025. It calls for banning porn.
Yeah.
Like, that is not where Donald Trump is. Donald Trump wants to ban being convicted for sleeping, he wants to ban being convicted for hiding the fact that you slept with a porn star during a campaign, right? Like, so there's this weird J.D. Vance, Donald Trump like difference here that like Trump chose Vance in some ways as this heir to MAGA, but Vance is a very different thing than Trump is.
Well, let me end by asking you this question. And Liz, I'd love you to chime in. Is J.D. Vance hurting Donald Trump or helping him?
He's definitely hurt him, in my view. It would have been if Trump had chosen Doug Burgum or Marco Rubio, he would be in significantly better shape today. One, he would have been more comforting to people in terms of, there's always this question. People are like who is Donald Trump really? Is he the guy, that you saw on January 6th? Or I actually remember the economy being pretty good in 2019. And a guy like Doug Burgum, a sort of boring business executive, would have been a signal that it's going in that other direction, right? Whether that signal would have been true, we could argue about. I sort of would suggest it wouldn't have been true, but it would have been comforting to people who maybe needed to be comforted. Instead, he gets Vance, which accentuates the ideological extremity, the weirdness of the people, not just Trump himself, but the whole Trump coalition that you're bringing back into power, right? That's why things like Project 2025 matter. Trump can disavow that all that he wants. The thing is, it's all the people who work for him and worked for him and will work for him again. And J.D. Vance is there writing the foreword to the book that Kevin Roberts, his forthcoming book, Kevin Roberts being the head of the Heritage Foundation that, oversaw Project 2025. So in choosing Vance, Trump ended up drawing attention to the part of his movement that is most unpopular and off-putting and unnerving, when his best argument was, weirdly, given who he is, a kind of stability argument. But he didn't pick somebody who accentuated stability. He picked somebody who accentuated kind of instability and uncertainty and weirdness. And yeah, I don't think Vance has helped this ticket at all.
Liz?
I totally agree. I mean, and let's remember, he picked J.D. Vance when Joe Biden was the candidate. It was a very different race, and it was sort of a shoo-in. And so, yeah, J.D. Vance doesn't expand. J.D. Vance doesn't reach people that Trump isn't reaching. And to Ezra's point, I think it's, hurting him with groups that would otherwise maybe would have voted for Trump. I mean, when Jennifer Aniston posted about J.D. Vance, a person who obviously has a lot of influence, but isn't necessarily on your bingo card of, who will take a stand or endorse anyone during an election. That's when I knew he's in trouble. And yeah, he's also Trump is charismatic at least, and funny and entertaining. And JD Vance is just, doesn't even have that. So yeah, I don't think Trump is thrilled about that decision. That would be my guess.
But I think I read recently that they've gotten to be surprisingly close, right, Ezra?
I mean, that might be true, right? Donald Trump might like him. And my view is basically that Trump chose a person a lot of us understood as an ideological choice, but Trump chose him because he seemed like the most loyal of the choices, right?
Plus, he's kind of like Don Jr., right? Don Jr.
wanted him chosen, as was Tucker Carlson and Elon Musk.
Right? And so I feel like that had a big influence, and it may not be a match made in heaven if Donald Trump hadn't been influenced by those other people.
Look, Trump may personally love J.D. Vance. There are a lot of people I really like who, if I were running for president, I would not make them my vice president.
On that note, Ezra, I know you have a lot to do. You're a very busy man. Thank you for taking the time to be with Liz and me today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. It was great to see you both.